first reading this morning is from Acts chapter 10, verses 34 to 43. Peter began to speak. I now realize that it is true that God treats everyone on the same basis. Whoever worships him and does what is right and is acceptable to him, no matter what race he belongs to, you know the message he sent to the people of Israel, proclaiming the good news of peace through Jesus Christ, who is Lord of all. You know of the great event that took place throughout the land of Israel, beginning in Galilee after John preached his message of baptism. You know about Jesus of Nazareth and how God poured out on him the Holy Spirit and power. He went everywhere doing good and healing all who were under the power of the devil, for God was with him. We are witnesses of everything that he did in the land of Israel and in Jerusalem. Then they put him to death by nailing him to a cross. But God raised him from the dead 3 days later and caused him to appear, not to everyone, but only to the witnesses that God had already chosen. That is, to us who ate and drank with him after he rose from death. And he commanded us to preach the gospel to the people and to testify that he is the one whom God has appointed judge of the living and the dead. All the prophets spoke about him, saying that everyone who believes in him will have his sins forgiven through the power of his name. The second reading is from Luke, chapter 24, verses 1 to 12. Very early on Sunday morning, the women went to the tomb carrying the spices that they had prepared. They found the stone rolled away from the entrance to the tomb, so they went in, but they did not find the body of the Lord Jesus. They stood there puzzled about this, when suddenly 2 men in bright shining clothes stood by them. Full of fear, the women bowed down to the ground as the men said to them, "Why are you looking among the dead for one who is alive? He is not here. He has been raised. Remember what he said to you while he was in Galilee. The Son of Man must be handed over to sinful men, be crucified, and 3 days later rise to life." Then the women remembered his words, returned from the tomb, and told all these things to the 11 disciples and all the rest. The women were Mary Magdalene, Joanna, and Mary, the mother of James. They and the other women with them told these things to the apostles. But the apostles thought that what the women said was nonsense, and they did not believe them. But Peter got up and ran to the tomb. He bent down and saw the linen wrappings, but nothing else. Then he went back home, amazed at what had happened. This is the word of the risen Lord.
Thanks be to God.
How you got all this? Just trying to get the thing to start.
Got the button on the on position.
Thanks, Charlie. In recent years, there's been much said by atheists and many Christians that in a modern scientific age, it's impossible to believe in the bodily resurrection of Jesus. It's just so foolish to believe that Jesus actually came from the tomb, that there's a whole stream of writing explaining how one can still be a Christian without believing in the resurrection of Jesus. We can believe in resurrection as a principle of life, a spiritual reality, if you like, rather than worrying about whether resurrection was an historical reality. But the truth is, there was never a time when believing in the bodily resurrection of Jesus was easy. Many carry a misconception that back in ancient times, people generally believed in dead people returning to life. They point to all sorts of evidence, like the way physical objects are buried with bodies for the use in the afterlife. Special ritual meals were had with those who died. Stories of dead heroes communing with the living, all pointing to the idea that when someone was dead and buried, that wasn't the end of it all. In some way, they continued to live. And the argument seems to be that in such a world, a pre-scientific world, the notion of Jesus returning to life after being dead for a time was believable. Yet, despite this astonishing array of beliefs about what happens when a person dies, there's no evidence at all that anyone at that time thought that this event was expected or usual. The story of Jesus risen from the dead was met with incredulity, mockery, and outspoken disbelief in much the same way as it is today. Yes, there were all sorts of ideas, popular ideas, mythological ideas, philosophical ideas about what happens when a person dies. This is still the same. Over the years, I've encountered all sorts of unusual ideas that people have when someone they love dies. I've been told of many objects that have been buried with a loved one, from teddy bears to favourite clothes to a bottle of whiskey. I had one funeral of a bikie, and the bikie members gathered round the grave after the funeral to share a drink with their dead friends. Having passed the bottle around, they poured the rest into the grave. None of those people really believed that their mate would actually come out of the grave and drink with them. No one actually believed their mate was drinking the whiskey they poured in. But we do these sorts of things. And so many have seen that sort of thing in the past and said, oh, well, you see, that's what they believed. Now, while among the philosophers such as Plato, Socrates and others, there were debates about what happened and where we went when we died, there was no belief that someone who'd been dead would return to this life, would be resurrected and actually walk around meeting and eating with their friends. In fact, the Platonic notion of the separation of body and soul, death was an escape from the imprisonment of the soul in an unworthy human body. So why, having finally reached this eternal freedom that death brought, would it be a triumph to return to bodily life? There may have been strong beliefs in some sort of life after death, but there seems to have been no belief whatsoever in the return to this bodily life of someone who died, even gone to life after death. So much that is written about this topic seems to be based on the understanding that something like must be the same as. Similarity is the same as identification. And Tom Wright, a biblical historian, has written this really quite huge book called The Resurrection of the Son of God. And as Tom is wont to do, he tries to carefully analyse a whole range of life after death beliefs and practices to see if any of them at all equate with the story that we're told in the Bible about Jesus' resurrection. There are many similar sounding ideas, but when examined properly, Wright concludes that they're no way in the same as what the early Christians claimed happened to Jesus that Sunday. Now, even though the Gospel writers tell us that Jesus had spoken about coming back to life before it happened, it's clear that no one actually interpreted these words to mean that he would come out of the tomb alive again. Even his closest friends wouldn't believe the first reports of his rising. There's nothing in any of the gospel accounts or in the writing of Paul that leads us to believe they thought that it was probable that Jesus would rise from the tomb. They, like many today, seem to believe that resurrection is impossible. I was listening to a lecture recently on this question by Professor John Lennox. Now, Professor Lennox is a professor of mathematics at Oxford University and is a well-known apologist for the existence of God and the bodily resurrection of Jesus. And he was speaking in this lecture, it was exciting, about the mathematical improbability of the resurrection. Wouldn't that be fascinating? Anyway, but in the question and answer time, someone said to him, if I was to come and tell you that I've risen from the dead, what proof would you need to believe me? John Lennox replied, I'd want proof that you've been dead. You think of it. And it struck me. And if you read Matthew's Gospel, Matthew is at pains to talk about Jesus' death. There's a long, detailed report of Jesus' Last Supper, his arrest, his trial, his crucifixion, and Matthew's a careful account of the burial of Jesus, of the stone being rolled in front of the tomb, of the Roman guard who sealed the tomb and stood watch. Matthew seems to be making sure that we understand that Jesus was dead. He was dead and buried. The precautions of sealing the tomb and posting a guard were not because they expected that Jesus was going to rise from this tomb, but it was because they were afraid that the followers of Jesus would steal the body and then start making this ridiculous claim that he'd come to life again. The idea that Jesus came out of the tomb alive was just as unbelievable then as it is today. Yet John Lennox says, we can't use inductive scientific method to validate the belief in the resurrection because we can't repeat it. That sort of scientific work is doing the same thing again and again to see if you get the same result. You can't do that. And so he says we need to use what's known as forensic scientific method to look at it all and try and use to see if there's any rational explanation for a non-repeatable event. And what intrigued me about this lecture of John Lennox was that he gives 3 pieces of evidence that convince him that it's both rational and believable that this event actually occurred, even though he says mathematically it's almost impossible. Now, I heard these arguments first about 40 years ago from a guy called Ronald Sider who came and gave us a lecture at college. And I noticed with interest that all these years later, John Lennox still finds them persuasive. And I've been doing some more research on that, and I've discovered a number of contemporary reputable biblical scholars who are still offering the same arguments for why they believe that Jesus actually came out of the tomb. So let me share them with you. The first one, they note that in all 4 Gospels, we are told that it was women who were the first to discover the empty tomb and to claim that Jesus had risen from the dead. Now, if this was a concocted story, then those who created it would have tried to make it sound convincing. Sorry to tell you, but women were never regarded as being trustworthy. Women were never called as witnesses in trial because you couldn't believe a thing they said. Luke himself says, you heard it in the Gospel this morning, that when the women told the apostles what they'd seen, their response was, it's nonsense. It's idle tales. And I wouldn't believe them. If you were going to make up a story that you wanted the world to believe, wouldn't you have told everyone that some reliable, important people with reputation were the first to see the risen Christ? If I was going to make up this story, I would have said it was Joseph of Arimathea or Nicodemus, two highly respected men who'd arranged for Jesus' burial. I would have said they came and discovered the tomb empty. Everyone would have trusted and believed them. If it was a made-up story, it was badly done. Why would you use women as your key witnesses? So that's the first thing to ponder. The second one, we know that both the Roman authorities and the temple authorities wanted to put an end to this new movement. They tried their hardest to stop the spread of the reports of Jesus' resurrection. All they needed to do to stop this nonsense was to produce the body, to show that the tomb was not in fact empty. If anyone had been able to produce the remains of Jesus, we would never have heard any more about Jesus. There had been plenty of other folk heroes who offered the promise of a new kingdom, a new reign. They were arrested, they were tortured and killed, and they faded into the mists of time. Yet this one story lasted and spread and took hold across the entire world. But it was not just the 11 disciples who spread the story. Within 20 or 30 years, Paul was writing to groups of Christians telling of Jesus' resurrection. If he was making it up, there would have been plenty of people still alive who could have stood up and said, "That's a load of rot. I saw the tomb and Jesus' body was there. They're making all this up." This was a harsh, violent culture where torture would not have been frowned upon like it is today. And if anyone had believed that Jesus was still buried somewhere, they would have used torture to find out where that body was. And we wouldn't be sitting telling the story. The third one is the behaviour of the disciples themselves. Remember, these were the men who fled in the Garden of Gethsemane. And on Thursday night, as I sat here, reflecting during that Tenebrae service, when I was listening again to the story of those disciples running away and leaving Jesus, I thought, wouldn't you think at least one of them would have stuck around? Wouldn't you think one of them had the courage? But they didn't, apparently. They all took off. And it wasn't long before Peter was saying, "I don't even know who you're talking about." These were the men who huddled together in an upper room after Jesus' death, afraid of the temple authorities, afraid that they were going to be the next ones. Yet within a few short weeks, these were the same men who faced hatred, arrest, persecution and death to travel far and wide telling everyone they met that Jesus, who had been crucified, was raised to life. And we heard that reading from Acts, where Peter was on trial before the Sanhedrin, and he was boldly telling the story of what had happened. It would have taken no effort at all to shut these people down. Were these timid, frightened men who ran away the moment it got really tough, would they be willing to die for a lie? Would they have faced death if it was all just a fantasy that they'd been spreading? It seems to me that as improbable as the resurrection of Jesus is, it is just as improbable to me that unless Jesus rose from the dead, that we'd be sitting here retelling this story today. It was the resurrection that marked the huge difference between Jesus and the many other messiahs that promised a new kingdom. It was the resurrection that turned frightened, ashamed disciples into bold, brave apostles. It was the resurrection that enabled the followers of Jesus to go and share the story throughout the world. Right from the beginning, the followers of Jesus told not about a spirit-filled, holy man who taught people to be good, but of a remarkable man who, though humiliated, abused, crucified, rose from a sealed tomb. They told of a crucified and risen Lord that they were ready to trust with their whole lives. They no longer feared death because now they knew that their resurrected Lord had promised an eternal hope. It changed the way they lived and loved and treated even their enemies. Now, I've tried to show you why I'm convinced that that tomb was empty that Sunday morning. That why I believe that Jesus did come from that grave. I still have a lot of questions. I've now got to try and work out, so what happened to the resurrected Jesus? But at the end of the day, it's not how I understand those events 2,000 years ago that make the difference between faithful disciples of Jesus and curious believers. The real question is, does this relationship with God impact your life? If we share in the risen life of Jesus, does it make a difference to the way we live our life? Now, I mentioned Ronald Sider, whose lecture I heard 40 years ago. And recently, I was saddened to read an article that he'd written about the moral and social behaviour of Christians in the United States. And I suspect that there could easily be a similar study and a similar article written about Christians in this country. He says statistical research shows that the moral and ethical behaviour of Christians is no different to that of non-believers. He suggests that there is little evidence that the beliefs and actions of Christians are transforming American society despite their huge political influence. He suggests that the majority of Christians have simply been shaped by the secular society, that their prejudices, their political attitudes, their sexual morality and relationships are no better than the rest of society. And we can argue all we want about how a Christian should understand the accounts of Jesus' resurrection. But if it makes no real difference to the way we live, Jesus may as well have stayed in the tomb. If we are to use the language of salvation, we're not saved by what we do, nor are we saved by what we believe. We are saved by God's grace alone. And if we believe that, then our lives should reflect our gratitude for the grace and love and forgiveness He's shown us. If we believe that God was reconciling the world to Himself through the life, death and resurrection of Jesus, then we should be living lives of resurrection, lives of hope and joy, lives of grace and love. Now, if you read the book of Acts, the account of those first followers of Jesus, you'll discover that it was the way that Jesus' followers lived that attracted new believers. See how they love one another, was said about these early Christians. The early Christians were known as the people of the way because they lived lives that were different. They lived a different way. Now, I know people who passionately believe in the bodily resurrection of Jesus and who are determined to convince everyone else of the truth of their beliefs and that they should believe the same as everybody should believe the same as them. And they are judgmental, bitter, negative and thoroughly unattractive people. And you think, why would I want to follow that way? They seem more shaped by death than resurrection. Rather than living joy-filled, resurrected lives, they seem entombed in their convictions, not set free by them. On the other hand, I also know Christians who say, I can't believe in the bodily resurrection of Jesus. But because they view it as a spiritual reality, they are open, joy-filled people, positive, encouraging people, people who accept others who are different with grace and love, who spread joy in all that they do. And their lives express the real resurrection of Jesus every day. When we're finally caught up in the resurrection of Jesus, no doubt we'll all be stunned to discover the truth of what God was doing in and through Jesus and his resurrection. Unless our faith in the risen Lord makes a difference to the way we live, the way we love, the way we serve one another, who cares? Why worry about what we believe unless we actually choose to live differently and to follow Jesus in making God's presence real in our everyday life? It's really easy for us to regularly pray, "Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven." But unless such belief is lived out, it's just so much more nonsense. I do believe in the resurrection of Jesus, but more importantly, I seek to allow this risen Lord to guide and empower and inspire the way I live. I fail. I make a mess. I let Christ down regularly. And I experience his forgiveness and hope and love again and again. Today, as we celebrate resurrection, I want to encourage you to be open to that resurrection life in your everyday life, to give you the grace and the love to be his faithful follower, and by your life, spread the joy of the risen life of Jesus. Amen.
Mom, why are you talking so long?
So,